Good afternoon or morning, evening, I guess, whenever you're going to watch this video, guys. Last review video for Unit 3. Big ideas 4, 5, and 6 from Unit 3 are actually really simple and straightforward. So hopefully this video won't be too complicated or complex for anybody. Just getting right into it. So big idea number 4, the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, as well as other constitutional provisions, have often been used to support the advancement of equality. I think that makes sense, right? That we know that the 14th Amendment provides everybody equal protection under the law. If people are supposed to be treated equally under the law, it makes sense that everyone should have equal rights. So we see this foundational document, right? Remember, we need to know those foundational documents for our exam. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, and kind of the whole civil rights movement, due process, justice, equality under the law for African Americans in the civil rights movement. The 14th Amendment is one of the biggest proponents in achieving that equality for African Americans. National Organization for Women, kind of the push for the 19th Amendment, you can see rooted in the 14th Amendment, that equal protection clause. The pro-life and LGBTQ rights protests, all of those things can have deep roots in the idea that the 14th Amendment's equal protection clause. The pro-life movement's the one kind of tricky one, because obviously we know that the ruling in that Roe versus Wade court decision is that women have the right to have an abortion. So it's obviously a more pro-choice argument. With this, though, what a lot of pro-life people say is that an unborn child should have those same rights under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. You guys actually did make this argument in your moot court, if you can remember that. So what happens with this is it leads to more state-led restrictions on abortions. So different states have different rules about how late a woman can have an abortion in her term, things like that. Which shows kind of how federalism can impact this, but again, rooted in the 14th Amendment. And then the LGBTQ rights, obviously the most recent of all of these, the LGBTQ community attempting to achieve equality in our society. If you might remember, we talked earlier in the year about a law in North Carolina over the use of bathrooms and transgender bathrooms, things like that. Again, rooted in the 14th Amendment, that people should have the right to use whichever bathroom that coincides with the gender that they identify with. Same idea here. They have that protection under the Equal Protection Clause. Okay. Big idea 5. Public policy promoting civil rights is influenced by citizen-state interactions and constitutional interpretation over time. What does this mean? Pretty simple. All this is saying is that how our laws sort of impact our lives and how our laws change over time is rooted in the Constitution, but also sort of rooted in like circumstance and experience and how different people experience a relationship with their government in different ways. So we see kind of this evolution that based on interactions between people in state and federal government agencies, or the laws in different states, if you will, they're basically going to lead to public policy laws changing over time. So you can see here kind of some responses to different social movements, things like that. So 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson, we have basically this idea that sure, African Americans have equality under the law with the 14th Amendment, but we're going to interpret that, as that separate but equal is okay, right? Segregation. And that kind of stays status quo, right? We see Jim Crow laws come out of this with the idea of federalism, that the states are able to kind of incorporate their own levels of laws to sort of put down the effectiveness of federal laws in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So then evolves. How does that change? Well, as Jim Crow laws get worse, as that Plessy versus Ferguson decision gets older and older and older, we have a different court now in the Supreme Court, new justices, right? So Brown versus Board of Education happens. Segregation of schools is determined to be inherently unequal, overturns the Plessy precedent. So now, again, this is a new experience, right? Citizens seeing something differently, a court interpreting something differently over time. So that past precedent is going to be changed, right? And now Brown versus Board of Education plays a role in what does that do? It affects 10 years later the Civil Rights Act of 1964. African Americans are going to achieve equality under the law. What does this all do? It sets precedent for, in 1972, Title IX, which is basically legislation that protects against discrimination based on sex in athletic programs or activities that receive federal financing. So this is where you're going to see this like sort of birth of women's sports and women's clubs on college campuses and in high schools to sort of balance out that if boys are getting all of these things, girls should also be getting them. Okay. Voting Rights Act 1965, same thing, sets the stage for equality under the law. So basically, what do you need to know from Big Ideas 4 and 5? The 14th Amendment provides equal protection for United States citizens under the law. That's been broadly interpreted to basically reach any kind of life situation, I guess you could say, that we can span this to schools, we can span this to jobs, we can span this to sports. That equal protection under the law is a very vague term, and that doesn't necessarily just mean in a courtroom, it means in life in general, okay? And we're going to see the court use that as precedent to change different decisions in these kind of landmark court cases that then affect future legislation. So again, thinking of checks and balances and how each branch can influence others, we're going to see that where the Supreme Court's going to make a decision that's going to influence legislation passed by Congress later on. Okay. And last but not least, finishing up here, very, very short. Big Idea 6, the Supreme Court's interpretation of the U.S. Constitution is influenced by the composition of the court and citizen-state interactions. At times, it has restricted minority rights, and at others, it has protected them. What does this mean? If you look back at the videos I posted in this unit already, you'll notice that we talked about how there's loose constructionists, strict constructionists, there's judicial activists, right? Judges that believe that their own personal opinions and feelings should influence their decisions. Other justices think the opposite. They're more restrictive, right? Where they're going to say, well, the Constitution doesn't say this, so we can't do it. Or the Constitution says this, I should keep my own personal opinion out of it. So where's an example of what this means? Affirmative action acts are basically laws that have been passed that say that employment opportunities should be increased for minorities and women, that they're at like government run levels, that is, so like federal and state jobs. There's discussions about whether or not affirmative action programs actually work and things like that. We're not getting into that here, but what the idea is that as time changes, right, we go from having a court in Plessy versus Ferguson that says, well, sure, like the federal government gave equality, but like, yeah, we still like, let's be segregated. And then the court changes over time. Brown decision happens, right? The court changes over time. And Congress changes over time. We see the Civil Rights Act passed. We see the Voting Rights Act passed. We see Title IX passed. And then we see affirmative action programs where we're trying to, with the goal of these, use the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, to guarantee equal opportunities and employment in state and federal positions for people who are women and other minorities, okay? Same idea with increased admittance to colleges and universities for basically if you are of an ethnicity or a gender, so women in this case, that has been historically less likely to go to college, things like that, affirmative action programs provide extra funding to schools who want to provide opportunities to those groups of people for education. So kind of hopefully what the idea is, and again, there's a debate for this, good and bad, that's for a different day, is to kind of bridge that gap that we have. I always tell my U.S. history students to blame white people for everything in history, right? We got these rich old white guys up here that have had all this privilege throughout their life, and we're trying to bridge that gap with some of these programs. And this is just one example, but basically the idea is that a Supreme Court, their decisions aren't set in stone for forever, right? That one court might think differently than another court. It only really takes one or two justices to retire and new justices to be nominated, and we can see major shifts in the court's decisions and some of the tendencies of the Supreme Court. All right. If you guys have any questions about Unit 3, feel free to reach out to me. I know some students, at least two, that are having a lot of problems with Office 365. If that's the case and you're able to see this video, reach out to me. I can share things with you through Google Drives, if you, or in Google Docs if you have a Google account. Don't, just do nothing. Please reach out to me so I can help you. All right. Close to the exam, guys. Only a couple weeks away. Take care.